Thank you and welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you all here again. Okay, so I hope there was lots to think about yesterday, and I'm sure there was, but a different way of understanding what Jesus was doing, really, trying to understand the reality of the life in which he lived, the reality of the Roman occupation, and how he's trying to address the reality. It wasn't the way God wanted it to be, it wasn't the way he wanted it to be, but that was just the way that it was. And so he just dealt with the reality that he found himself living in. So we'll carry on looking at this, but first of all, some questions came up in the conversation at the end there about the Gospels and things. So the first thing, if you go and study at the seminary or the theology college or somewhere, you find out that when you read the Gospels, they're not biographies of Jesus. They're not biographical accounts of Jesus. They're not objective in that way, and they don't even pretend to be objective in any way. They're very stylized theological accounts of the life of Jesus, which are written for a particular purpose, and the purpose is to convert people. That's why they're written, to convince people that Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ. So when we read them, we can't just read them naively, assuming that everything, just because it's written in the Gospels, therefore it must be true. We have to read it as if we were reading any piece of literature. We have to understand the context. For example, when were they written? Well, they're written, most of them, in the late 1st century or 2nd century, quite a long time after Jesus died. And then who wrote them? We don't know exactly who wrote them, but when you look at them, you can see that actually there many hands went into making them. It looks like some people tried to find original source material, but then this was edited and re-edited, and it was organized and arranged in a particular way. So there's an overall structure and framework for each of the Gospels, which is quite different. Yeah. And again, one needs to understand that, why they're written, and also who they're written for. So the Gospel of Matthew particularly is often called the most Jewish of the Gospels, and it looks like it was written by Jews who believed in Jesus, particularly for other Jews who didn't believe in Jesus. When you look at the Gospel of Luke, it looks like it was written for other people. And it's often assumed that it was written by someone from Paul's church who wanted a gospel of the life of Jesus, but found the Matthew is a bit too Jewish. And so in the Gospel of Luke, there's other Gentile interests, which are more interesting for people who weren't Jews. Mark is also different again, and John is also a very, very different kind of gospel. Again, written for a particular spiritual community. And again, we need to know what the writer and the editor is trying to say. What message was it that they were trying to convey through the gospel? So you have to recognize what the theology of the gospel is, or the angle of the editor. Why did they edit it in a particular way? And then we have to try and, go behind the editing to see what was the raw material in that sense. What were the authentic sayings of Jesus? What were the authentic things that really happened, as opposed to things that were spun in a particular way? Because sometimes there's something that happens and it doesn't really fit with what the gospel writer wants to say. So sometimes he'll spin it in a particular way, just like a journalist will do, or just like politicians do. There's some uncomfortable fact, doesn't really fit with their narrative, and so they try to spin it in a particular way. And the gospel writers do just the same. And also need, as I said, to understand the social context that the Gospels are written in and the argument they reflected. So written very much as an argument. Divine principle is as well. So how do you decide how do you read it critically? So when you come across a verse or a passage and it contradicts the traditional Christian narrative or theology, then biblical scholars say that's probably authentic, because the editor wouldn't have made it up, because it doesn't fit with what he wants to say. So if it's like that, then it's probably an authentic saying or probably an authentic event. So if you think about what is a traditional Christian narrative, well, it's Jesus was born to die, and he's rejected by the Jewish people, and he was God. So if you find passages or verses which contradict this, then you have to think, oh, okay, that's interesting. That's probably authentic. And at the same time, if it supports traditional theology, then maybe this is an editorial addition. So, for example, many times you read the gospel and it says something like this: he said this because he knew he was going to die. So that's the editor. Yeah, Jesus says something, and then the editor puts it in a context. He said this because of this. Yeah, so they're spinning it in a particular way. Anyway, there's lots of, I'm not going to go into how to read the Gospels critically. So again, something else one needs to understand, why there's so many quotes from the prophets. You read the Gospel, the New Testament, and it's full of quotes from the Old Testament, from the prophets. You might wonder, why is that? And that's because the New Testament was written by Jews who believed in Jesus. All the Gospels and all the letters, they were all written by Jews. They were Jews who believed in Jesus. And so what they were trying to do is to persuade Jews who didn't believe in Jesus that Jesus was the Messiah. And so that's why they're constantly bringing up quotes from the prophets in the Old Testament. They're trying to persuade Jews who don't believe in Jesus that Jesus is the Messiah, because Jesus fitted and fulfilled these prophecies. And so the reason why they chose the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures is because that was the common source of authority. If they're going to argue about something and to try and prove their point, both sides, the Jews who believed in Jesus, the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, they'd be looking for texts in the Torah and in the prophets that would prove their point. And they're always exchanging texts backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. It was like an argument. Yeah? And so that's why the Gospels are the way they are. It's a result of a long argument the Jews who believed in Jesus had with the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, and how they're trying to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. So when you read it then, the Gospels, Jesus' life is written so as to fulfill as many prophecies as possible, actually about 300. Yeah? This is, so for example, you find things like, this is just as it was written in the scripture. So Jesus did something, and then the editor will say, this is as written in the scripture, and then there'll be the little quote from the prophets. So for example here, this is Jesus himself saying here, gosh, what was the context again? Can't remember. Anyway, Jesus is saying, but then how would the scriptures come true? They say it must happen in this way. That was, again, towards the end of his life. These words are in his mouth. This is what happened because it had to happen this way to fulfill the prophets. The sense that the crucifixion of Jesus was inevitable, it was prophesied, and it was what was supposed to happen. Okay, what about the teachings of Jesus? So again, as I mentioned yesterday, Jesus upheld the Mosaic law. He said very clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law. So Jesus wasn't someone who was trying to abolish the law. He wasn't somebody who tried to break the law or did break the law. He lived by the Jewish law, the Mosaic law. As I said yesterday, he was also probably a Pharisee. So all Jesus' teachings and practices were on the spectrum between these two rabbis. Rabbi Shammai, there's two major schools of rabbis or Pharisees. Rabbi Shammai, who's very strict, and Rabbi Hillel, who's much more liberal. And everything that Jesus taught and did was somewhere on the spectrum between these two poles. So often you'll find it says in the Gospels, the Pharisees said this. The Pharisees criticized Jesus about that. It would be much better if the Gospel writer said some of the Pharisees, because Jesus himself was a Pharisee. He was within that tradition. So it'd be better to say some Pharisees criticized Jesus because he did this, whereas other Pharisees would have agreed with him. Yeah? Unfortunately, it's written in that particular way, which again I explained yesterday. And again, Jesus told his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they say. So again, Moses held the teachings of the Pharisees in extremely high regard. And he certainly didn't teach his disciples that they should ignore them or break the teachings of the Pharisees and their interpretations, that they themselves should live within that spectrum of understanding. And the way Jesus taught, the use of parables was typical of Pharisees. I mean, to be honest, he told better parables than they told, really, when you compare them, but it was within that kind of tradition of teaching, a way of teaching. So amongst the Pharisees then, there's a large range of interpretations. So this freedom of interpretation meant that even if Jesus had original interpretations or different readings of the text, it would just be different. It wouldn't be an excuse or reason for him to be killed. Because there's no sense within Judaism that people should be killed just because they got a slightly different or different interpretation of the law. So in that sense, Jews are not Christians. Christians are really concerned about, do you believe the right thing? And historically, in medieval Europe, if someone didn't sign up to the Nicene Creed, or didn't do this, or believe this, or this, or this, they were called a heretic, and they could be kicked out of the church and worse. Jews are not like that. Jews argue endlessly about different ideas, different ways of interpreting the text. They're more concerned with how people live, whether you're observing the law or not observing the law. But what you actually believe is up for grabs, yeah, within that framework of how you should live a moral life. And then again, you read in the gospel, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees very, very severely. But again, the criticisms he made of the Pharisees were typical of the criticisms the Pharisees made of each other and also made of themselves. There's not much difference there. As I said, Jesus was basically just a typical Jew. If you want to read more about this is a very good book, Pharisees, Scribes, and Sadducees in Palestinian Society. And it's important to understand, there's a few quotes I'm going to have from this professor about, I'll read it first. He said, a Jesus who talked like a Jew and an early Christian community that looked like a Jewish sect troubled many 19th century German Lutheran scholars. So most of the sort of modern biblical scholarship started in Germany, with Protestants, primarily people like Bauer and people like this, Strauss, The Life of Jesus. They analyzed the gospel very, very critically, and that was the beginnings of New Testament scholarship, critical scholarship started there in Germany. But anyway, but they had a problem though. As I said, this is the problem. A Jesus who taught like a Jew and an early Christian community that looked like a Jewish sect troubled many 19th century German Lutheran scholars who preferred to envision a Jesus who taught a new and unique doctrine that overthrew the established tradition. And many of us have inherited that basic assumption, not just 19th century German Lutheran scholars. This assumption and perspective permeated most Protestant churches till today. Albrecht Ritschl, I don't know how to pronounce that. Anyway, he's one of the greatest of the German New Testament scholars. He solved the problem by attacking the Jews. For him, Jesus did not reform or transform Judaism, he condemned it. And, you can find many verses to justify that if you want to. Jesus the Jew, in Ritschl's view, transcended Judaism by purifying Christianity of its Jewish elements. From the middle of the 19th century until World War II, numerous German scholars, including Adolf Harnack and Rudolf Bultmann, followed Ritschl's lead in one way or another. None were Nazis, but reading them after the Holocaust leaves us with an eerie sensation. Because that's what was going on. They didn't like the Jewishness of Jesus, and that's one of the reasons for the switch to claim that the Gospel of Mark was the oldest gospel, whereas historically Matthew was always regarded as the oldest gospel, which is why it comes first of the four gospels, and the Catholic Church until very recently regarded Matthew as the oldest gospel. But German New Testament scholarship didn't like that because Matthew is really Jewish, and so they claimed that and argued that Mark was the first gospel and that Matthew copied Mark. And Mark is the least Jewish of the three gospels, the synoptic gospels. And so again, to wrench Jesus out of his Jewish world destroys Jesus and destroys Christianity, the religion that grew out of his teaching. Even Jesus' most familiar role as Christ is a Jewish role. If Christians leave the concrete realities of Jesus' life and of the history of Israel in favor of a mythic, universal, spiritual Jesus and an otherworldly kingdom of God, they deny their origins in Israel, their history, and the God that has loved and protected Israel and the church. So there's a particular strand within Christianity, early Christianity, called Gnosticism, which sought to do that. And the Gospel of Mark is very much like this sort of hypothetical Gospel of Marcion, trying to say Jesus wasn't a Jew, he was some kind of universal figure, bringing salvation in that way. They cease to interpret the actual Jesus sent by God and remake him in their own image and likeness, which is what people often do, again, as I mentioned yesterday. The dangers are obvious. If Christians violently wrench Jesus out of his natural, ethnic, and historical place within the people of Israel, they open the way to doing equal violence to Israel, the place and the people of Jesus. This is a lesson of history that haunts us all at the end of the 20th century, and which is haunting us all much more 20 years later, to be honest. The rise of anti-Semitism again. And you might wonder, well, these are German Lutheran scholars. They're Lutherans. Where might they have got their basic prejudices from? So you might wonder, well, who said this? First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. That's how we prove we're Christians, by burning synagogues. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught, be taken from them. Fourth, I advise that their rabbis be forbidden to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for Jews, for they have no business in the countryside. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them. Seventh, I recommend putting a flail, an axe, a hoe, a spade, distaff or spindle into the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and letting them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. But if we are afraid that they might harm us, or our wives, children, servants, cattle, etc., then let us emulate the common sense of other nations, such as France, Spain, Bohemia, etc. Then eject them from our country. That was Martin Luther. Runs really deep. And that, of course, influenced these German Lutheran pastors. And that, of course, created a certain kind of atmosphere within Germany in the 20th century. So I want to pick up now a little bit from where we left off yesterday. Again, we talked about Jesus and how he'd been well received. And then 3 years after he starts his ministry, he goes into Jerusalem. And he goes in on a donkey. And that's the reference I meant before. Jesus said, I'm going to go into a donkey so that prophecy can be fulfilled. Sorry, I forgot where the quote came from. And as he went in with thousands of followers. Crowds of people followed him as he went in. As we know, they put down palm branches. And as he went in to the gates of Jerusalem, they cried out and they shouted, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. So you can imagine, again, yesterday I talked about this issue. Jesus didn't want to become made the King of Israel. Jesus didn't want to be proclaimed the Messiah. But here people are proclaiming Jesus as the King of Israel. And you can imagine who's standing on the gates of Jerusalem. There'll be soldiers standing on guard and policemen standing on guard. And suddenly this huge crowd of people is coming in for the Passover, and the person who's leading them is being proclaimed the King of Israel. So you can imagine there, the policemen, they would have sent reports back to their authorities, and the police authorities and to the people running the temple and everything. And so when this news arrived to the high priest, the chief priest said, look how the whole world has gone after him. The whole world has gone after him. So Jesus is incredibly well received by his contemporaries, the Jewish people. Obviously not everybody. It's an exaggeration, but that's what it says in the gospel. Obviously there's thousands, tens of thousands, we don't know how many people, but there was a lot of people who were supporting and following him. And again, in the Gospel of John, this is all in the Gospels, yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in him. There's sometimes people think that, only the ordinary people support and follow Jesus. But the reality, as it says in the gospel itself, many of the Jewish leaders also believed in him, supported him. So you might wonder, well, who are these Jewish leaders? Well, these are just the ones that are mentioned in the Gospels. One is Joseph of Arimathea. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. That's the highest ruling court within Judaism. It's like the equivalent in political terms of being the Senate, or within religious terms, like the College of Cardinals in the Catholic Church. So he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and he was a rich man. Another one was Nicodemus. He was also a member of the Sanhedrin, and he was also a Pharisee. Joseph of Arimathea was also a Pharisee. And then it's also believed in the early church that Gamaliel, who was actually the leader of all the Pharisees, was also a supporter of Jesus. And the reason why this is assumed within the early Christian church is because after the crucifixion of Jesus, then the disciples went around preaching. And some of the religious leaders were upset. And so some of these disciples are brought in front of the Sanhedrin to be punished. Yeah? But Gamaliel said, if this is from God, we cannot stop it. If it is from man, it'll just fade away. So just let them go and do their preaching. So this is based upon the assumption that Gamaliel was actually a supporter of Jesus. So this is the leader of the Pharisees, who was very sympathetic towards Jesus and his disciples and followers. There's also Jairus, who's the leader of the synagogue, and Jesus healed his daughter. So you think about it, after 3 years, Jesus had religious leaders of this kind of quality following him. After 3 years. You think about Father, after 3 years after he started his ministry, did he have cardinals, archbishops supporting him? No. Jesus is incredibly well supported by religious leaders amongst the Jewish people. These are Pharisees, as I said, not by the priests. We'll come to that later. Okay, so this is the big problem then. When Jesus arrives in Jerusalem and his followers are proclaiming he's the King of Israel, even though he really wouldn't have liked them to do that, as I said, the King of Israel and Messiah political titles, which is why he rejected attempt to make him the king. He told his disciples not to say he was a Messiah, because both of these are political titles and thus a threat to Roman authority and rule. Who decided who's the King of Israel? The Romans. They were the occupying power. They appointed Herod the Great to be the king. When Herod the Great died, they appointed one of his sons, Herod Antipas and Philip, and also to be rulers in his place. So the Romans, they were the ones who decided who was the King of Israel. So if somebody arrived in Jerusalem for Passover, being proclaimed by his followers as the King of Israel, obviously this is a threat to Roman authority and to Roman rule. So when the high priest heard about this, one of his jobs, we'll come to it later, was actually he was responsible for reporting rebels and this kind of situation. So then one of the things that Jesus did, first of all, he went into the temple, and we know he drove the money changers from the temple. Very simple. But the reality is that what this was seen as by the chief priests and the priestly establishment, he saw this as a threat to their authority. He was challenging their authority. And this is, again, a traditional Christian reading of the New Testament. The importance of this episode, driving the money changers from the temple, is signaled by the fact that within a week of this incident, Jesus is dead. Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree that this event that functioned as a trigger for Jesus' death. It's very clear that because Jesus did that, he upset the religious establishment who control the temple, and it directly led to them feeling threatened and to wanting to arrest him and to have him put to death. So the question is, well, why did Jesus do that? Why did he do that? So I don't know, but there are some people who say, okay, Jesus knew he was supposed to die. This is one particular way Christians will interpret this event. They say Jesus knew he had to die, and so Jesus had to act in a certain way so as to orchestrate his own death. So the reason why Jesus did this was to upset the religious establishment, so they would arrest him and so that he would be put to death. Yeah. Nowadays you call it suicide by cop. Yeah. It's weird, but I've read in people who interpret the New Testament in that way. Maybe Jesus thought that was the right thing to do, but all you can say is this has led to his death, basically. And there are also other stories that go beyond that within the very early Jewish and also very early Christian tradition. There are sources which indicate that not only was Jesus driving the money changers from the temple, he actually went into the Holy of Holies. And that his brother, who is one of his disciples, James, put on the breastplate of the high priest. And that John the Beloved also put on the mitre of the high priest. And so it looks like Jesus is trying to overthrow the priestly establishment and seize control of the temple. It's kind of interesting. It certainly led to his death. So kind of interesting. Anyway, the next day, the authorities didn't actually arrest him immediately. He clashed with the chief priests. When Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and elders of the people came to him as he was teaching, and they asked him, "What kind of authority do you have for doing these things, cleansing the temple? Who gave you this authority?" Jesus replied, "I have a question for you. If you tell me the answer, I'll tell you what kind of authority I have to do these things. Where did John get his authority to baptize? Did he get it from heaven or from humans?" They argued among themselves. "If we say from heaven, he'll say to us, then why didn't you believe him? But we can't say from humans because we're afraid of the crowd, since everyone thinks John was a prophet." Then they replied, "We don't know." Jesus said to him, "Neither will I tell you what kind of authority I have to do these things." So you can see here they're really angry and upset, but also at the same time, they're very much aware that the ordinary crowd of people, ordinary Jews who had gone to the temple for Passover to worship and celebrate Passover, supported Jesus. Yeah, and they were afraid if they contradicted Jesus, that might be their end. Yeah. And then we have this parable shortly after this, the parable of the tenants, which David brought up yesterday. Let's listen to a parable. There's a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. Then he rented it to tenant farmers and took a trip. When it was time for harvest, he sent his servants to the tenant farmers to collect his fruit. But the tenant farmers grabbed his servants. They beat some of them they killed, some of them they stoned to death. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first group. They treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them. "They'll respect my son," he said. But when the tenant farmers saw the son, they said to each other, "This is the heir. Come on, let's kill him, and we'll have his inheritance." They grabbed him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. "When the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenant farmers?" they said. "He will totally destroy those wicked farmers and rent the vineyard to other tenant farmers who will give him the fruit when it's ready. Therefore, I tell you that God's kingdom will be taken away from you and will be given to a people who produce its fruits." Now, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard the parable, they knew Jesus was talking about them. They were trying to arrest him, but they feared the crowds who thought he's a prophet. So again, it's basically he's speaking here to the chief priests. Then some editor later on added in the Pharisees, because I explained yesterday there's a lot of argument going on there. It wasn't the Pharisees, it was the chief priests. And what's the meaning of this parable? Well, the people who Jesus was speaking to, they knew exactly what he meant, which is why the chief priests are so upset. This is from Isaiah, and God says, "Let me sing for my loved one, a love song for his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it, cleared away its stones, planted with excellent vines, built a tower inside it, and dug out a wine vat in it. He expected it to grow good grapes, but it grew rotten grapes. The vineyard of the Lord, who rules over all, is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines in which God delighted." So that parable from Jesus, he is putting a spin, or he's using this parable from Isaiah to speak to the people, so they understood what he was saying. So here the landlord is God, the vineyard from Isaiah is Israel. So the tenants then, they're the leaders, they're the chief priests. The servants are the prophets, and the Son is Jesus. So what Jesus is saying here, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you." He's not saying taken away from Israel, the Jewish people. He's taken away from you, the priests, and the chief priests understand it as such. The crowds of people don't think that Jesus is saying the kingdom of heaven is going to be taken away from them, the Jewish people. It's just taken away from the chief priests. and given to people producing the fruits of it. So what Jesus is expecting here is that the Jews who believe in Jesus will become the future leaders of Israel. Yeah, it's not the idea of the Jewish people being replaced, but the chief priests being replaced by Jews who believe in Jesus. Maybe that's what he was trying to attempt there, trying to have regime change in the temple. But chief priests obviously were not happy about this. Then the chief priests and elders gathered and took counsel to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be a tumult among the people. So they realized that the people were on Jesus' side. And not only the people, but also many other leaders amongst the Pharisees in particular. And the priests themselves were not popular because they're known to be corrupt. That's why the Essenes went off to the Dead Sea. But the question is then, sometimes you think then the chief priest and the high priest, they were just trying to cling on to power. But actually it's much more complicated than that. So this is the conversation reported in John that went on between the chief priests and the high priest. So one of the chief priests said, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. That's how well received Jesus was. And the Romans will come and destroy our holy place and our nation. So their great fear was that because Jesus is so well received and so well supported, their great fear was that Jesus had tried to lead an uprising to overthrow the Roman authorities. And you can't overthrow or defeat the Romans, most powerful military force in the ancient world, the Mediterranean world anyway. They knew the Romans would come out of their barracks and destroy the temple and destroy the nation. That was a real risk. So Caiaphas, the high priest, said this, it's expedient, or it's better, that one man should die for the people and that the whole nation should not perish. So you have to think, Caiaphas, what kind of decision was he making? He was making a very utilitarian and very political decision. He thought, this is the reality. It's a real risk, a real present danger that this will get out of control and the temple and all the Jewish nation will be destroyed. It's much better just to nip it in the bud and just kill Jesus and the whole thing will fizzle out and we can keep the whole show on the road. So you have to think, if I read this and I thought, oh, if I was Caiaphas, would I have made a different decision? Really? If I was Caiaphas, would I have made a different kind of decision? Knowing what Caiaphas knew, yeah, you'd have to say that's a political decision that he had to make. And based upon the evidence and the knowledge that he had, he made the right decision. Of course, in hindsight, and theologically, you know, it's a totally wrong decision, but it's not that he was a bad man. He was making that kind of decision, trying to keep the show on the road, trying to maintain peace in this incredibly intense situation of the Roman occupation. And it was a very real and present danger. 40 years after the death of Jesus, there was the first Jewish revolt. This led to the Roman armies laying siege to Jerusalem, and the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed. There was a second Jewish revolt, 60 years later. Then 500,000 Jews were killed, nearly 1,000 villages were destroyed. Jews were forbidden to live in Jerusalem, and Judea is renamed Palestina. And they didn't come back for 2,000 years. That was the political reality of the time. Yeah. And that was the political reality that Jesus understood, and as I explained yesterday, was trying to solve, but also that Caiaphas understood. And he was also trying to avert this kind of disaster. Yeah, both Jesus and Caiaphas were trying to avert this disaster which came about. So who was the high priest then? This is from Chaim Maccabee, wrote about these things. He was a Jewish scholar of the first century, Judaism and Christianity. He said, as an appointee of the Romans, the high priest was not just a ceremonial official with jurisdiction over the temple. He was, in effect, a chief of police with his own armed force, his own police tribunal and prisons for political offences. In the case of serious insurrection against the power of Rome, he would hand over the offender to the occupying Roman power. So he wasn't elected as a religious leader to represent the Jewish people. He was appointed by the Romans. and he's appointed by the Romans to do a job. His job was to maintain order in the temple and to maintain order in Jerusalem. And he had his own police force, like a secret police force, and they kept their ears to the ground to find out, is there anybody who's going to cause a disturbance? Is there anybody who's going to cause a threat to the peace? Yeah, anybody who's going to try and lead an uprising. And if he found somebody, then he would have them arrested. They'll be tried in court, his own court, which is where Jesus was tried, and put in prison. And if it's a really serious thing, he would hand that person over to the Roman authorities. In the time of Jesus, as Pontius Pilate. Now, any high priests who wouldn't go along and cooperate with the Romans, they were fired. They lost their job. So Caiaphas had been the high priest for 13 years. So he knew how to work the system, yeah? Keep his job, but also to maintain order in Jerusalem. So what was the problem here? The problem is the high priest is acting based upon the knowledge that he has. But the problem is he doesn't actually know who Jesus is. And he doesn't really know what Jesus is teaching. He probably just heard rumors about Jesus is teaching this and Jesus is teaching that. And Jesus says he'll overthrow the temple. And you know what I mean? We've been there. You can imagine the high priest heard all kinds of scandalous things and sound bites about what Jesus was teaching. And so he probably got completely the wrong end of the stick. So that was the problem. There was the high priest didn't know Jesus or what he was teaching, and there was no mediator between the two. So who should have been the bridge between Jesus and the high priest? Well, obviously it should have been John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the son of the high priest. He would have grown up in the temple. And even though he left the temple to do his ministry by the River Jordan of baptizing, he would have known the chief priests. He probably knew Caiaphas personally. He could have gone up to Caiaphas and said, "Hi, Uncle Caiaphas, I want to tell you about Jesus. You think he's a real problem, a threat, but actually he's got a plan. He's got a plan to try and solve this problem between the Roman occupation and the Jews. He's trying to teach the Jewish people not to hate the Romans, not to have a violent uprising, but to turn the other cheek, etc., etc." And then if the high priest had got it, what Jesus is really about, he would have realized, actually, Jesus is safe. I don't need to have Jesus arrested. Yeah, Jesus, I need to find a working relationship with Jesus. But the problem was John the Baptist was not there. And there was nobody else that we know of that could have been that kind of mediator and approached Caiaphas and explained all this to the high priest and the chief priests. Sometimes people say, what about the leaders of the Pharisees like Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea? But the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't like each other and didn't get on well at all. There's a lot of conflict between the Pharisees and Sadducees. And the Sadducees, because Jesus basically was a Pharisee, then the Sadducees, the high priest, he wouldn't have taken what they said seriously. So that was a problem. So the high priest then, this is my reading of it, misunderstood who Jesus was and what his plans were. And that was a disaster. So the problem is then, Jesus has got no way to explain to the high priest what he's about. The high priest has got no way to get his hands on Jesus. Both of them are looking for some way, out for different reasons, of course. So you can imagine then, maybe one of the priests said, "Oh, Caiaphas, I went to school with one of Jesus' disciples. Actually, I know where he lives. Maybe I can go and set up a meeting so that we can, get our hands on Jesus," because they didn't know where Jesus was staying and which motel or hotel or whatever, or which campsite. And so maybe one of the priests got in touch with Judas. And maybe Judas is thinking, and maybe Jesus and the disciples are thinking, how can we find some way to reach the high priest? Yeah, so he can understand what we're really about. And so maybe this priest approached Judas Iscariot and said, "Hi, Judas, do you want to have a coffee?" And they talked and they caught up. And the priest said to Judas, "Look, Caiaphas is really interested in meeting Jesus. He'd like to know what Jesus' message is, what he's teaching. Maybe Jesus can do a miracle or something." Yeah. And so maybe Judas thought, "Oh, that's interesting. I'll go back and talk to Jesus about that and see what he says." And there's this, "What will you give me if I had to deliver him to you?" Okay, instead of deliver, maybe we could just say introduce him to you. Yeah, and they paid him 30 pieces of silver. Now, if you want to meet an important politician, you need to find a mediator, In order for the mediator to set up the meeting, you got to pay them some money. Yeah, so maybe it wasn't delivery, maybe it's just introducing. So the question is then, well, how much did Jesus know about what was going on? So this is during the Last Supper. And these are words that Jesus is supposed to have said. One of you is going to hand me over to my enemies. Okay, so Jesus seems to know something terrible is going to happen. Now, if you believe that the crucifixion is supposed to be God's will, then that's okay. But if you think the crucifixion is not supposed to be God's will, then obviously that's not okay. And Jesus said, is one who I give this piece of bread to. I'll give it to him after I've dipped it in the dish. He dipped the piece of bread, then he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told Judas, what you're about to do quickly. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some had thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival, to give something to the poor. So let's analyze this. Jesus said to Judas, what you're about to do quickly. Now, if Jesus thought Judas is going to betray him, so that he's going to be arrested and be put to death, you'd have to say, okay, that's what Jesus wants. Jesus wants to be arrested and he wants to be put to death. And Jesus says to Judas, go and do it quickly because you're the way that I'm going to be able to fulfill God's will and be crucified for the sins of the world. That's the normal way of reading it. Yeah, but at the same time, if Jesus didn't want to be crucified, you'd have to think, well, why did he tell Judas to do it quickly? Why is Jesus telling Judas to set up this meeting quickly? Maybe Judas came back from this conversation with his priest and explained to Jesus, an old school friend of mine met me, and he knows the high priest, and he said the high priest would like to meet you. And, he asked me if I could set up a meeting. What do you think? And maybe Jesus thought, wow, this is a great opportunity for me to be able to meet the high priest. So what you're about to do, go and do it quickly. I need to meet the high priest quickly before this whole situation gets out of hand. Something like that. Okay. Then you've got this sort of thing here. Satan entered into him. Again, that's peculiar. Obviously, nobody can see it. So obviously, it's an editorial gloss. But if this is supposed to be God's will, that Jesus should be arrested and put to death, why would Satan be entering into Judas to do God's will? So obviously the disciples knew that the crucifixion wasn't supposed to happen. They didn't know what Judas was going to do, because it wasn't, obviously, because they said nobody understood what Jesus said this to him. So they're speculating here about what happened. They're speculating that Judas deliberately wanted to betray Jesus in some way. So there's it's kind of confusing trying to make sense of this. Yeah. What I can say, I just don't think it's as simple. If you think about it at the time, you have to ask yourself, well, okay, why would Judas want to betray Jesus? Was Judas a good person? I would say, yeah, he was a good person. He was a disciple of Jesus. Without being a good person, he never would have been one of Jesus' closest disciples and most trusted disciples. If he'd fallen out with Jesus because he didn't like what Jesus was teaching or what Jesus was doing, then he would have packed it in and left. But actually, he was going with Jesus into Jerusalem. Yeah, obviously, he's very, very close to Jesus, explaining all this stuff to Jesus. So I think he was a very good person. I just think things didn't turn out the way he expected. So in hindsight, people think he was bad and betrayed Jesus. Anyway, so as you know, after the Last Supper, they all went into the Garden of Gethsemane where they were staying, and Jesus prayed this very desperate prayer, hoping to be able to see the night through to the morning when they could all go home to Nazareth. And then in the night, Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests. Am I leading a rebellion that you've come with swords and clubs? The detachment of soldiers, its commander, and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. So Jesus has been arrested by the Roman authorities here. This is a commander of a cohort of probably 30 or 40 Roman soldiers, along with some officials from the chief priests. The soldiers are the ones who got the swords. The officials, the Jewish police from the high priest, they'll just have clubs or wooden sticks. Yeah? So Jesus then has been arrested by the Romans, the Roman authorities. And then he's arrested, he's taken to the high priest's house. Then the chief priests, and again, read this, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for something to use against Jesus. They wanted to put him to death. But they did not find any proof, even though many false witnesses came forward. So this trial is supposed to have happened at night. That's not possible, because the Sanhedrin, by law, cannot meet at night. And the Jews are great sticklers for keeping the law. So this is not a meeting of the Sanhedrin, okay? This is the meeting of the high priest's police tribunal, his police court. Yeah, they're looking for something to put Jesus for, but they can't find anything. There's no reason for him to be put to death. And so it's at night, there's no proper procedure. It certainly wasn't the whole Sanhedrin there. There were just some officials, probably from the chief priests. There's no valid charge, no real evidence. They're trying to frame him. Anyway, so then Jesus then, when this is put on trial in front of the high priest. When Judas saw that Jesus was condemned by the high priest, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So from this, we can try and unpack what was going on. You have to say, okay, what we do know is a historical fact, because it's not just in Matthew, it's in other Gospels. Judas hanged himself. Okay. Also, he tried to give the money back. Also, is filled with remorse. So the way things turned out is not the way Judas expected or wanted things to turn out. If he'd sold Jesus because he wanted the money, he would have put the money in his pocket and gone home. Yeah. Obviously, what happened wasn't what he expected to happen, or what he wanted to happen. He took the money back and said, "This isn't what we arranged. It's just supposed to be a nice coffee after dinner coffee between Jesus and the high priest." And he realized he'd been tricked. He realized he'd been taken for a ride. And he realized then that actually he had caused, by what he'd done, by his naivety, you might say, the death of Jesus. And he could no longer live with himself. He was filled with so much remorse, so much regret, that what he thought he was doing something good to advance God's providence, so Jesus and the high priest could get connected. But the result of this was the arrest and the death of Jesus. And he couldn't live with the consequences of what he'd done, so he killed himself. He hanged himself. So when you look at this, you have to say, okay, Judas then, I don't think he didn't have the intention to betray Jesus. When you look at it in hindsight, you can say, yes, as a consequence of what Judas did, Jesus was killed. But that wasn't what Judas intended. Yeah, Judas, I think, had a good motivation for what he was doing. Unfortunately, he was taken for a ride. He was tricked. He was deceived by his friend and lied to by his friend, which is why he went back and wanted to give the money back, because he felt betrayed. Judas felt betrayed by his friend. So Jesus then, the next morning, early in the morning, he's tried by the high priest at night, so very early in the morning. Pilate is woken up and he's really annoyed. And Jesus is brought before Pilate. Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? So what kind of charge is this? It's a political charge. Jesus has been charged with a political crime for being called or proclaiming himself the king of the Jews, and thereby challenging Roman authority and Roman rule. Jesus said, you've said so. When he's accused by the chief priest, he made no answer, not even a single word. So, very intense. As it says in the principle, Jesus was killed after being branded a heretic by religious leaders and a rebel by the Roman Empire. In reality, Jesus wasn't a heretic. Yeah? He was on the spectrum of the beliefs of the Pharisees. And he was brought before Pilate on a political charge, because that was the job of the high priest. So who is Pilate? He's a Roman governor for 10 years. He disrespected the Jewish traditions. He was chastised by the emperor on several occasions. He took money from the temple for his own purposes. He slaughtered Samaritans, and eventually he caused so many problems in Palestine, in Israel. He was withdrawn by Rome. And this is Philo of Alexandria, who was a contemporary of Jesus and Pilate. And he wrote, Pilate's tenure was associated with briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injustices, constantly repeated executions without trial, and ceaseless and grievous cruelty. So Pilate then was a very, very harsh ruler, governor. And we saw that from that situation where, you know, he brought the standards into Jerusalem and he was willing to put to death all those Jewish people if they wouldn't cooperate and humiliate themselves. So then we have this very notorious incident, which everybody knows. Now, at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. And several Gospels said it was a custom. But the reality is quite different. Scholars have looked for evidence and so far have never found anything in reference to the so-called custom of releasing a prisoner on Passover. There was no such custom. It didn't happen. Pilate certainly wasn't the kind of person that would do that. Yeah? So this event then is a fabrication. And so allegedly, while Pilate was sitting on his judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him. Yeah. So how likely was that? This is Helen Bond, Professor of Christian Origins from Edinburgh. She wrote a lot about this, a whole book about Pontius Pilate. If history was causing trouble at the gathering like Passover, when the city was overcrowded to bursting, I don't think Pilate would have spent much time worrying about what to do with him, with Jesus. It was entirely up to the governor as to how he dealt with the case. And after hearing the evidence, he no doubt thought that getting rid of Jesus was the best course of action. That's the kind of thing Pilate typically would have done. That was according to the historical record. He was that kind of a governor who happily, eagerly crucify someone like Jesus. But apparently there's a crowd of people cheering for Barabbas. And Pilate says, do you want Jesus or Jesus Barabbas? And apparently the crowd supported Jesus Barabbas. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather the riot was beginning, a Roman governor would never let a riot begin. He would have sent the soldiers out to sort them out. He took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children. This is a notorious blood curse. So what's going on here? Pilate is saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. So when Pilate washes his hands before the crowd, he's saying, I, the Roman governor, the Roman Empire, Rome, is not responsible for the death of Jesus. Yeah? And the people as a whole, even if this event did take place, it's just a random crowd of people who happen to be up early in the morning, it gives the impression that people as a whole, in other words, they hold a referendum and all the people in Israel voted Jesus should be put to death. His blood be on us and our children. So what just happened here? So through this little few verses, this little incident, Pilate, Rome, and the empire were absolved of the responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus. And instead, the responsibility for the crucifixion of Jesus was transferred to the Jewish people as a whole, and to all their descendants. That's what's happening here. Even though in reality, as we saw, Jesus was received very well by the people and by many religious leaders. So this then led to what's called in Christianity the culture of contempt. That for 2,000 years, Christians have treated Jews with contempt because they rejected and killed their Messiah. So for 2,000 years then, Christians haven't felt guilty, but instead have felt justified for mistreating Jews as a way of punishing them and their descendants for what they were supposed to have done to Jesus. Does that work anywhere else in the world, in human history? Look at the Greeks. They sentenced Socrates to be executed. Does anybody say, oh, we need to go and punish the Greeks for what they did to Socrates 2,500 years ago. How does that work? How do you go around thinking, oh, your ancestors killed somebody, an innocent person, 2,000 years ago, so we're going to mistreat you today? It's shocking when you think about the moral consequences and the morality behind this whole thing. It's deeply and profoundly shocking. And so, well, what can we say about this incident? This is Ulrich Lutz, professor of New Testament, one of the greatest scholars on the Gospel of Matthew. He died relatively recently. He described this incident, which I described there, as a redactional fiction invented by the author of Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew, the editor, invented this. It's a fabrication. This whole thing of what happened with Pilate, Jesus, and Barabbas is a fabrication. It's a work of fiction. And again, Helen Bond said, Matthew says that while the Romans actually carried out the deed, the Jews were responsible. A line of argument that has, of course, had disastrous consequences ever since. So you might wonder, well, why did the editor of Matthew do this? Why did they do that? Well, the reality is, Christians then, they were witnessing in the Roman Empire, and they're being persecuted. Yep, that's a reality. They were being persecuted, thrown to the lions, etc., etc. But at the same time, 40 years after the crucifixion, the Jews revolted. They rebelled against the Roman authority. So they didn't want Jesus to come across as a political subversive and a rebel against Roman authority. They didn't want the blame for the death of Jesus to be put on Pilate and the Romans. They didn't want, because they were getting persecuted enough as it was, without this idea that the Romans were responsible for the death of Jesus. And so what they did is they transferred the blame for the crucifixion from the Romans onto the Jews. And in this way, they were able to deflect the persecution they were receiving onto the Jews. You know, they could separate themselves from the Jews, and they could separate the Romans for the responsibility for the death of Jesus. It's a little sleight of hand, just that little incident. It changed the whole tone of the Gospels, which are very supportive of Jesus. This little sleight of hand, and everything is turned around. And the Jews now are accused of rejecting Jesus as a whole, and of demanding that Jews should be put to death, and even of killing Jesus. So the Jews then were accused of rejecting and murdering Jesus. And that is why, as I think David asked me, or somebody asked me yesterday, that is why the picture of the Romans in the Gospels is so favorable. Pilate is presented as a nice, fair, just person. And the last thing he wants to do is to have Jesus put to death. The Roman centurion, Jesus said he's had nowhere could I find more faith in Israel than this Roman centurion. Yeah, the Romans are given a really, nice, glossy presentation in the Gospels, whereas the Pharisees are presented in a very dark way. Yeah, and then Jesus then was turned into a spiritual Messiah. All the political content was removed from what he was teaching, and now it's all just about forgiveness of sins and being born again. And there's nothing to do about establishing the kingdom of heaven in this world. All the political content was taken out. He was just a pacifist. And so that's the presentation of Jesus we have until today. It's all about believing in Jesus, being born again, taking the sacraments. And when you die, you're going to go to heaven. It's not about creating heaven in this world and challenging injustice in this world. And sadly, the church, for many countries, sided with the establishment with injustice. Okay, we're going to take a break now, and then we'll have a look at how this worked out in practice. Carrying on here, looking at the impact then, how this developed within the Christian church, this attitude towards Christianity. So this is a particular person here I studied when I was at Cambridge, Melito Sardis. He was a bishop of Sardis. He was the most influential bishop in Asia at that time, during the 2nd century. So it's very early in the Christian church. This is the kind of person, Jerome, who's one of the greatest of the church fathers, testifies that Tertullian, who's one of the earliest Christian theologians, saw him as a prophet due to his work on the first Old Testament canon. So he did a lot of work on creating the Old Testament canon. It was the same books as the Hebrew Bible, but just organized in a different order. Polycrates, again another very, very famous early Christian, said, Melito, whose whole walk was in the Holy Spirit. So he was someone who was Jewish by birth, but he was a Christian Jew. He's a Jew who believed in Jesus. And he's the author of this Peripashka, which is on the Passover. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from this. It's a very powerful sermon and piece of writing. So having worked his way through all the Old Testament, all the prophets and the history of the Old Testament, he comes to Jesus, and now he's talking about how Jesus is treated 2,000 years ago. And Melito says, this one, Jesus, was murdered. Where was he murdered? In the very center of Jerusalem. Murdered. Jesus wasn't murdered anyway. He was executed by the Romans on a political charge. Yeah, that's the reality. He was executed by the Romans for trying to lead a political overthrow the Romans. But anyway, he was accused of being, said he was murdered. Where was he murdered? In the very center of Jerusalem. Why? Because he'd healed their lame, the Jews, and had cleansed their lepers, and had guided their blind with light, and raised up their dead. So he's been murdered because of all the good things he did for them. So why, O Israel, did you do this strange injustice? You dishonored the one who had honored you. You held in contempt the one who held you in esteem. You denied the one who publicly acknowledged you. You renounced the one who proclaimed you his own. You killed the one who made you live. Why did you do this, O Israel? The one who hung the earth in space, this is a belief that Jesus is God, is himself hanged. The one who fixed the heavens in place is himself impaled. The one who firmly fixed all things is himself firmly fixed to the tree. The Lord is insulted. God has been murdered. The King of Israel has been destroyed by the right hand of Israel. So this is a very powerful and shocking accusation which has resonated for 2,000 years of Jewish history, that the Jews rejected and murdered God. Now, that's the accusation which we find throughout Christian history, and we find echoes of this in our own spiritual community as well, that the Jews rejected and murdered the Messiah. And here we can see lots of passages, lots of illustrations. This is Jesus. All these people with these yellow hats, they're all Jews. Yeah, this is just a typical illustration from a religious text, that Jesus was crucified by the Jews. It's a Jew who's putting the sword, the spear in his side. But the reality is, well, who actually killed Jesus? This is Paul Winter. He did he wrote a very well-known scholar. He died a long time ago, wrote in the 60s, a book about the trials of Jesus. And he said, in the tangled mass of evangelical accounts of Jesus' trial, one point stands out with clarity. He was arrested as a rebel. The Roman soldiers went and arrested him with a commander of a cohort of Roman soldiers, a really important Roman official. He was accused before Pilate as the king of the Jews and found guilty as such and executed as such, which is why above the cross was the king of the Jews. None of the later accretions, which means none of the later additions in the Gospels, overlay the original primitive account, and none of the editorial modifications from the hands of successive evangelists can hide or disguise the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was arrested, accused, tried, sentenced, and executed on a charge of insurrection against Roman rule in Judea. That's just the plain facts of it. But on top of that, as he says, and as I've been pointing out, there's been a lot of spin doctors, a lot of bits been added here, there, to try to present Jesus not as someone who's trying to overthrow the Romans, and instead transfer the blame for what happened onto the Jews. Yeah, so he wasn't that's just a historical record. And it's taken Christians a long, long time to finally come to terms with this. A long time. Only since the Holocaust have Christians started to examine maybe there's some responsibility for what happened to Jews in the 20th century. So last year, there's a lot of controversy in the UK about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn and the Church of England decided to write a paper about anti-Semitism. And then Church of England then last year concluded and admitted that Jews did not reject Jesus. The Jews did not kill Jesus. And so just about a week after that was published, this professor from Oxford, very well known, he appears on television a lot, most prominent scholar at the moment on the history of the early church. He wrote a letter to the Times which said Christianity started out as a heretical movement within Judaism. The Christians who believed in Jesus, the Jews who believed in Jesus. Yeah. Its four Gospels contain unmistakable elements of hostility to what was then the Jewish establishment. There's loads of that I pointed out, including shifting the blame for Jesus' death from the Romans to the Jewish authorities. This is a scholarly conclusion now. You know, Christians finally are beginning to take responsibility for the lies that permeated 2,000 years of Christianity. By an accident of history, of course, you know, some people would say by God's providence, Christians then gained established status in the Roman Empire. Powerful Christianity can now use the earlier rhetoric against the Jews to marginalize them. And that's what happened for the next 2,000 years. And then, as we know, then Jesus was put on the cross, and he is mocked on the cross. And have a look at this. What were Jesus' last words? So on the cross then, Jesus reestablished the foundation of faith and the foundation of substance. He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Sometimes people think, oh, he shouldn't have said that. He's not demonstrating faith in God. If we actually go, what he's doing here is he's quoting the first verse of the 22nd Psalm. You read the 22nd Psalm, it's almost like a description of everything that Jesus is going through. Someone who feels completely abandoned by God, totally desolate. But at the same time, when he describes the reality of his situation, out of that reality, this terrible situations, and he reaffirms his absolute faith in God and determination to proclaim about the justice and the goodness of God. So this is a demonstration of faith. And then that was his faith. He trusted God, didn't say to God, oh, I didn't expect it to turn out like this. This wasn't what I was promised to sit, sit on the throne of David. Again, he said, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. So he forgave and loved his enemies. And into your hands I commit my spirit. So again, if Jesus had cursed the people and cursed the Romans, then there would have been no resurrection. If he'd lost faith in God, there'd be no resurrection. So Jesus on the cross restored the foundation of faith and substance for his own resurrection. And when he went down into hell, after he was killed, he went and he proclaimed the good news to all the spirits who were in hell. And of course, Satan wasn't happy to find him emptying hell. And so it says in the principle, in compensation for Satan exercised maximum power in killing Jesus, God exercised maximum power and resurrected Jesus. And so we have the empty body, the empty tomb, the missing body. Jesus appeared not only to his own disciples, but he also appeared to 500 followers up in Galilee. He appeared in a locked room, he ate food. Anyway, some kind of special body. No, it never happened before or since that anybody's ever resurrected. But anyway, Jesus' body somehow disappeared, something happened. Anyway, so it disappeared. You probably know about the Shroud of Turin, an artifact which is in the Catholic Church in Turin. Some people believe this is the original burial shroud of Jesus. Maybe it was. And there's another similar kind of piece of cloth which is in Spain. A haunting picture of Jesus here, if that was Jesus. So the question is, which I've always often wondered, why do Christians believe the crucifixion was God's will? Why do they believe it was God's will? So this is something that happened. This is after the crucifixion. That same day, two of them were walking to the village, Emmaus, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem. They were deep in conversation, going over all these things that had happened. In the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along with them. But they were not able to recognize who he was. He asked, "What's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" They just stood there, long-faced, really depressed, like they'd lost their best friend. That's who Jesus was, their best friend. Then one of them, his name was Cleopas, or Peter, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what has happened during the last few days?" He said, "What's happened?" They said, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in word and deed, blessed by both God and all the people." Yeah, all the people. "Then our high priests and leaders betrayed him and got him sentenced to death and crucified him. And we had our hopes up that he was the one about to deliver Israel." Yeah, they didn't expect the crucifixion. They didn't want the crucifixion. They wanted the establishment of the kingdom of heaven. Now it's the third day since it happened. But now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning, they were at the tomb and couldn't find his body. They came back with a story. They'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it empty, just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus. Then he said to them, "So thick-headed, so slow-hearted. Why can't you simply believe all that the prophets said? Don't you see that these things had to happen, that the Messiah had to suffer, and only then enter into his glory?" Then he started at the beginning with the book of Moses, went on through all the prophets, pointing out everything in the scriptures that referred to him. They came to the edge of the village where they were headed. He acted as if he was going on, but they pressed him, "Stay and have supper with us. It's nearly evening. The day is done." So he went with them, and here's what happened. He sat down at the table with them. Taking the bread, he blessed and broke and gave it to them. At that moment, open wide-eyed, they recognized him, and then he disappeared. Back and forth they talked. Didn't we feel on fire as he conversed with us on the road, as he opened up the scriptures for us? So that's really interesting. When I read that, I realized, the reason why Christians believe that the crucifixion is the will of God, because after the resurrection, Jesus told them that it was. And I remember when Father went to Danbury, we were all praying and fasting and lots of court cases, so he couldn't go to Danbury in America. And the day before, or even maybe the morning he went to Danbury, he gave a speech to everybody, and he said, "It's God's will that I should go to prison in Danbury. Because I'm going to prison in Danbury, all kinds of amazing things are going to happen. And American Christians are going to come and support me at last. And this is going to happen, and that's going to happen." Yeah. So Father then explained that what happened was God's will. He embraced it as God's will. Just like when Father's in Hungnam. He didn't spend all his time trying to shirk doing the hard work. Instead, somebody asked him, what were you thinking when you're in Hungnam? And Father said, "I thought I was born to do this. I thought I was born to carry sacks of fertilizer on my back from one place to another. This is the purpose and meaning of my life." And then he said, as I carried these sacks, filled up these sacks of fertilizer and carried them, I thought to myself, I'm carrying millions of people from Satan's world on my back to God's world, which meant that he was able to make everything that he did, every step he did, incredibly meaningful. But he embraced it as God's will. Just as he embraced going to Danbury as God's will. Because of this, all kinds of incredible and great things can take place and can happen. And I understood that is exactly what Jesus did. After the crucifixion, after the resurrection, he didn't blame his disciples, you shouldn't have fallen asleep, and you shouldn't have done this, you shouldn't have done that. He explained it differently. And so that's why there's so many contradictions in the Gospels. On the one hand, it looks like he should have established the kingdom of heaven. But on the other hand, there's this whole re-editing to make it look like it was God's will. And that came from Jesus. It's extraordinary, generous, and magnanimous that he treated and took it in that way. And he gave his disciples opportunity to restore the mistakes they'd made. So Peter denied him 3 times and obviously felt really bad about it. So Jesus gave him 3 opportunities to restore the mistake he'd made by reaffirming and affirming his love for Jesus. And then that's 40 days of the resurrection. Jesus, rebuilt the faith and loves of his disciples, and then there was the ascension, and then there's Pentecost, and Jesus sends the Holy Spirit, who became the spiritual true parents, bringing in spiritual rebirth. So that's spiritual salvation. We can enter a realm where Satan cannot invade. But that's certainly not what Jesus wanted when he set out on his mission. It's certainly not what the disciples expected. It's certainly not what the Jewish people expected and wanted. They're wanting and expecting the Messiah to establish peace and justice in the world. And that's why I don't think Jesus would have gone down to Jerusalem if he thought he would have been arrested and killed. I think he would have bided his time, built up a stronger foundation, spent more time trying to figure out how he could develop a relationship with the political and religious authorities in Jerusalem, with whom he didn't have much relationship. I think that's what he would have done. But I think during that week, he realized he wasn't able to do what he hoped he was going to be able to do, and things spun out of control, and I think he got caught up in the machine and was killed. But as it says in the beginning of Gospel of John, to all who believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God, who are born not of the blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. So that's a spiritual salvation and change of blood lineage which we experienced. So what happened after the crucifixion? Well, as I said, 40 years after the crucifixion, there was a Jewish revolt, and Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed with it. And you can see here, this is the Arch of Titus in Rome. And here, this was built by Titus to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. And you can see here the menorah and all the gold and all the precious things from Jerusalem being taken to Rome. All the gold was looted from the temple and taken to Rome, the precious things. They might wonder, what did they do with it? Well, Vespasian, who was the general that later became the emperor, he used the treasure from Rome to rebuild Rome. You look at the Colosseum, which is still standing 2,000 years later, and you think that must have cost a lot of money to build. The money to build that came from the Jewish temple. And what happened in the Colosseum? Gladiators fought with each other to the death. Christians were burnt and fed to the lions on the money raised by the Jews for the worship of God. Temple of Peace, the public baths, the new forum, all these buildings in Rome, they were built with the money from the Jewish temple. And they should have a little sign outside saying that. Since people are talking about putting new signs up outside statues. Then, 60 years later, another one. I mentioned this about this before. So what was going on then at this time? So, as I said, Jesus was a Jew. All his disciples are Jews. All the early church, they were all Jews who believed in Jesus. Christianity for many, many years, about 100 years, was regarded as a Jewish sect by other people, because they're mostly Jews who believe in Jesus. So there's a conflict here between two groups of Jews, the Jews who believed in Jesus and the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus. So let's try and unpack the dynamic of what was going on here, this tangled relationship. So the question is then, for the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, how could Jesus be the Messiah if he was killed? The Messiah is not supposed to be killed. The Messiah is supposed to sit upon the throne of David and establish peace and justice. So that's why Jews till today say Jesus was not the Messiah, because he didn't fulfill the messianic task or role, establish peace on earth, defeat Israel's enemies, spread the universal knowledge of God of Israel, to unite humanity as one. So they say Jesus didn't fulfill the messianic task. So why did the disciples believe Jesus was the Messiah, even though he didn't fulfill the messianic task, even though he was killed? Because they encountered the resurrected Jesus. The Jews who believed in Jesus said he was the Messiah, even though he'd been killed. So trying to persuade the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, because of this, because he didn't fulfill the messianic mission, that he was a Messiah even though he'd been killed, because they experienced the resurrected Jesus. And so then the argument moved on. So the argument moved to Jesus was supposed to die. Not only is he the Messiah even though he died, but actually he was supposed to die. As I explained to you, Jesus said that, and that everything he did was in fulfillment of prophecy. So if you look through the Gospels, you'll find there that Jesus appears to have fulfilled more than 300 prophecies from the Hebrew Bible. Micah, Isaiah, Psalms, Zechariah, Numbers, so many of the things that you see written in the Gospels, it refers back to a prophecy that Jesus is supposed to fulfill. Even if it doesn't do it consciously, you can check it and it's there. So the Gospels basically, they're an argument to persuade people Jesus is the Messiah because he fulfilled the prophecies and was supposed to die. So it's an argument still between the Jews who believed in Jesus, trying to persuade the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus that Jesus is the Messiah because he fulfilled the prophecies and he was supposed to die. So the question is that when I read the Gospels, as I said, it's not a biography. All Christian scholars accept it's not a biography. It's written in a very stylized way. So did the Gospel writers present Jesus' life in such a way that it would fit the prophecies? Yeah, they fit so closely, you have to wonder, well, did they present Jesus' life so it would fit the prophecies, so they could convince other Jews? But at the same time, as I said, they knew that he should not have been killed. So that's why there's this basic contradiction at the heart of the Christian message, which we know from the principle. Well, the Jews, though, they would argue that these prophecies and the Gospels have been misinterpreted and used as proof texts, which is, of course, what Christians would say about to unificationists, about the way we use the Bible. We find a little verse in the Bible to prove what we want to say. Same sort of thing. So that was after the First War. Oh yeah, then after this you had the war, the Jewish-Roman wars. The Jews rebelled against the Romans, but the Christian Jews, they were pacifists because Jesus was a pacifist. So they decided they weren't going to participate in this rebellion against the Romans. So they left Jerusalem and they went to Pelia. And the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, they were disgusted with the way the Christian Jews behaved by just packing their bags and going, and they accused them of betrayal. So a relationship between the Jews who believed in Jesus and the Christian Jews became very intense. And of course, there's a trauma of the destruction of the temple. There's a trauma for the Jews living in Israel. There's no longer any sacrifice, the Sadducees disappear from history. And the Jews' lament was, on account of our sins, so the Jewish attitude is, because we sinned, the temple was destroyed and we were exiled. So the Jews' lament was, on account of our sins, we were exiled from our land. The diaspora, which has gone on for 2,000 years, was turned by Christian Jews into words of accusation. On account of your sins, you were exiled from your land. So here the Jews have become other. So the Jews who believed in Jesus were now speaking to the Jews who didn't believe in Jesus as other, othering them, no longer sharing their sense of identity. And today, still, the Jews who fail to accept Jesus now, they fail to, So again, there was this accusation in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Christians witnessing to Jews say, you fail to accept Jesus now, just like your ancestors failed to accept Jesus then. So these conflicts in the 1st and 2nd century are read back and projected back into the time of Jesus. And then a new center was started for Judaism, the beginnings of Judaism as we know it today. There was a curse on heretics. So there's Jews who didn't believe in Jesus are very upset with the Christian Jews, primarily on theological grounds because they claim Jesus was God. This is anathema to Jews, the idea that a human being could be God. They could not accept that because it's two gods. So there's lots of arguments then about the person of Jesus and some people rejecting or accepting his divinity, arguments about observing or not observing Jewish law, rival claims of traditional Jews and Christian Jews to inherit the blessing of Abraham. And so they got this name Israel. And so the Christians then, the Christian Jews, they said, we are the new Israel, you are the old Israel. You failed, we are the new Israel. We've inherited the blessing of Abraham. So it's getting more and more intense, this relationship. Then there's a second Jewish-Roman war, 50 or 60 years later. This time, Bar Kokhba, who was a Jewish general, he was proclaimed as the Messiah by Rabbi Akiva. Yeah. To Christians, though, he was a false Messiah. He's the Antichrist, because they say the true Messiah is Jesus. Therefore, Rabbi Bar Kokhba is a false Messiah. And so the church then is gradually separating itself from Judaism and establishing its own identity as a separate religion. But then you have the changing identity of the next generations. So the children of Jews who believed in Jesus didn't think of themselves as Jews anymore, but as Christians, and inherited the anti-Jewish sentiments of their parents. So all they heard their parents doing was accusing the Jews of rejecting Jesus. They were accusing the Jews of being a failed religion. Who wants to belong to a failed religion? So the children of the Jews who believed in Jesus decided we're not Jews, we're Christians. See the same in our own spiritual community. And then the church increasingly became Gentile as non-Jews entered into the church, and it became more Gentile. And you had this idea of a dispensational replacement theology. The Old Testament, New Testament, Old Israel, New Israel. The Christians have replaced the Old Israel, which failed. And Judaism rejected, the churches of New Israel. And so the blame for the crucifixion is put on the Jews, and an accusation which goes on till today: you killed Jesus. So it's not unusual for a Jewish child to go to school where they're Christians, and to meet a Christian child who'll say to this Jewish child, you killed Jesus. And then the Jewish child goes home and says to his parents, why was I told that I killed Jesus? That's the way it works. It's shocking. This has been passed on. So my personal conclusion is, of all this, that if Jesus had been rejected by his Jewish contemporaries, he would have faded into obscurity. If the Jews had rejected Jesus, he would have been standing on the street corner preaching with nobody paying any attention to him whatsoever. He certainly wouldn't have been seen as a threat to the authorities and arrested and crucified. So Jesus wasn't crucified because he was rejected by the Jewish people at all. If he had been, we never would have heard of him. So the reason Jesus was killed was because he was so well received by the Jewish people as a whole, and many of the religious leaders, apart from the high priest and the chief priests, who were collaborators of the Roman authorities. He was so well received that he was perceived to be a threat to the establishment, and so he was executed by the Romans on a political charge. If things had gone differently, I think he would have mediated a peaceful resolution of the relationship and fulfilled the messianic task. So again, yesterday I explained what Jesus' plan was, how to resolve this intense hatred the Jews had for the Romans, and to resolve the contempt the Romans had for the Jews, and show the Jews how to win the love and respect of the Romans to try to resolve this incredibly intense situation. And I think if things had worked out differently, I think he'd have been able to do that. Yeah. He got stuck with the politics. And supposing he'd been able to do that, I think he would have been appointed king of the Jews by the Romans, as the Romans were the occupiers. I think they would have recognized Jesus would have made himself very useful to the Romans, because he would have been the only person who'd be able to win the love, win the respect of the Jewish people, and be able to resolve the situation with the Roman occupation. The high priest couldn't do that. The high priest and the chief priests, they weren't held in much respect at all by the Jewish people. The Jewish people sided with Jesus against the high priests and the chief priests. Yeah? And the Romans would have known that. Whereas if Jesus could have been able to mediate this relationship, I think the Romans would have realized, oh, he's our man. He's the one who can sort out this problem with these troublesome Jews. They would have appointed him to become king of Israel. Then, of course, as king of Israel, he would have traveled to Rome. He would have met the Roman emperor, done whatever he wanted to do there. He also would have traveled east to Parthia. Sometimes people think that it was a good thing that Israel was part of the Roman Empire. On the contrary, it wasn't. If Israel had not been part of the Roman Empire, I have no doubt whatsoever, if Israel had been an independent state, I have no doubt whatsoever that the way Jesus was received, I have no doubt whatsoever he would have become the king of the Jews, made the king of the Jews by the Jewish people themselves. But because of the political realities, it was really complicated because of the Roman occupation. There was another empire to the east called the Parthian Empire. It was just as big as the Roman Empire. It was just as technologically advanced. And the reason why the Romans didn't move further east to reoccupy the space that Alexander had conquered when he created the Greek Empire, Alexander's empire, the reason they couldn't move any further east because there's another big empire there, the Parthian Empire. And they defeated the Romans several times. They were just as militarily strong as the Romans. But they had a very different kind of policy towards the people in their empire. They gave the nations and the religious people in the empire a lot more space. They just wanted taxes, but they didn't interfere and try to micromanage them in the way the Romans did. So if Israel had become part of the Parthian Empire, I think they wouldn't have had this whole political kind of complication that there was with the Romans. The Babylonians, the Persians, they didn't try to destroy Judaism. The Greeks did, and the Romans did, but the Parthians, the Persians, the Babylonians, they weren't interested in that sort of thing. They wouldn't have got involved in that kind of level. And then all the nations of the world would have come to worship God in Jerusalem, as it says in Isaiah. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established at the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. Okay, I'll stop there, because we need some time, obviously, for some questions. And I hope you found it interesting. Again, I said yesterday it'll be even more controversial today than it was yesterday or the day before.